Hey y'all. Hey. Welcome to the Octavia Butler mixtape course. Let me know if y'all can see me. Let me know if you all can hear me. Okay, perfect. Let me know if you can see me. Let me know if you can hear me. I'm super excited to talk about Wild Tea Part 2. Can y'all believe that we are already done with the first book of the Pattern series? I'm going to start bringing people up. So if you want to get up here, be a part of the panel tonight, just go ahead and, y'all know how to do it. Request to come on up. We got a lot to talk about. We have a lot to talk about. Okay. I'm eager to know what y'all thought about the end of the book. I'm so eager and so interested to figure out what you thought about it, right? This is the first book of the Pattern series, and we just wrapped it up. Next week, someone said this book had me all over the place. That is definitely a real place. Next week, we start Mind of My Mind, you all. So I want to make sure everyone has their copy of Mind of My Mind. Of course, Survivor is the next book. I will be distributing that on the Substack probably next week, so that everyone will have enough time to read it. It is a photocopied version. Download it, do whatever you need to do with it, because we need to talk about it if we're going to read the entire series. As I said, if you want to hop up here to join the panel tonight, you are more than welcome. Someone says, I threw the book across the couch when I finished. I feel like that's fair. People have mixed reviews about the ending of the book. Right? Some people have they change their perspective of Anyanwu. Some people change their perspective of Doro. I'm just here to discuss. I am happy to discuss it with y'all. So, Sir Maxim says, if there weren't 4 more books, I'd be furious. But you want to know what? Butler did not publish these books in order. So by the time, this is how you would have had to read the books. Pattern Master, 1976. Mind of My Mind, 1977. Survivor, if you can get a hold of it, 1978. Then there's a pause with Kindred. Wild Seed, 1980. And then there's a 4-year pause. And then Clay's Arc, 1984. So people were reading these books out of order. And if I would have had to read these books out of order, it would have been a no for me, dog. I'm just gonna say it would have been a no for me. All right, so before we get started, I want to go ahead and read something from Conversations with Octavia Butler. It's really about the Patternist series, because we are in the Patternist universe, and I've been trying to kind of prime you all on how to read the book on the Substack. If you've been following along or reading the post I've been writing, I've been trying to guide you in the way that you should probably be reading them, because I think it's important. I wish I would have had some type of guide when I first got into the Patternist books, because it would have probably given me a totally different perspective. But anyway, I'm going to read something from the Conversations with Octavia Butler. This is an interview from 1988. And the interviewer asks, what was your original conception for the Patternist series? I know, for example, that they weren't published in order in which you wrote them. Did you have an outline for the whole series? And Butler says, no. They were in my head for so many years that I didn't need an outline. I conceived of the first 3 books dealing with 3 different time eras. Mind of My Mind takes place in the present. Pattern Master is set on Earth in the distant future. And Survivor, which occurs in the near future, deals with those who got away but didn't fare well because they were so strong in their religion that they couldn't consider self-preservation. Okay, so I thought that was fascinating and something to consider as we read. The interviewer goes on, let me see. Okay, the interviewer goes on. He says, when you actually started to work on this series, did the books take shape in independent, sorry, now I act like I can't read. The question is, when you actually started to work on the series, did the books take shape independent of one another? And she says, no, they were all going on at once for a long time. I couldn't finish any of them. I had been able to finish some short stories, which were about 20 pages long, and I finally decided to try writing 20-page chapters until I finished each novel. Of course, the chapters all ended up being different lengths, but having that goal helped me trick myself into completing the first novel. And as y'all know, the first novel is Pattern Master. And so if you ever go to the Huntington Library, you will notice that Butler is writing multiple stories at one time. She did this with the Parable series. She also did this with the Xenogenesis trilogy. She's writing each book at the same time. And it's so wild to see that she's able to master that strategy. But she does. And I think that points to her genius. All right, it's 6:09. We're not going to belabor the point. What's up, y'all? How y'all feel? What's going on?
Oh, man. Oh, man.
What's going on? Wild Seed, organic thoughts.
Listen, so I finished the book last week, or like the same day that we only had to stop at the 143. So I've had 2 weeks to chew on this. I continue to be a hate account for the men in the books you suggest. This is a hate account for Doro, still to this day, bestie. I don't care about him crying. I don't care. This is a hate account. I also do not, I have thoughts around Anyawu because yes, she is a victim, but also is she not a perpetrator in her own right? Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
Because first off, as a slave master, anyway, we're gonna get to that. And then my other thought is there's something to be said about their relationship because we see, and I know we're gonna touch on this because I haven't read it, but I just have a sneaky foreshadowing feeling that the reason the transition is so smooth and sudden when the abusive, terrible son shows up is because she's a nurturing environment. There is something to be said about like catalysts and the way they enact change depending on the environment. So the transition is always terrible and fraught, full of like wrath and all that jazz when Doro is going through it. But just suddenly people are transitioning peacefully. It's because of her. It's because of the love and care. She's the nurturing fertility demigod, and he is the wrathful, vengeful, evil spirit. So I do think that's going to have like a tie-in in the future as to why we see like it going better for those because now they're a union, a toxic, unhealthy, terrible union, but a union nonetheless. And that's it.
Okay. Point taken, points taken. Oh, and Yang was a perpetrator. Okay. I can get behind it.
Tachi, hi. Yes. Like I said last week, two sides of the same coin. I don't have it for her. I don't have it for him. I just don't. And I think we're going to talk about it a little more as we get into your questions. But I don't see her as a victim at all. Everyone has a choice. She makes poor ones. He's easy to hate because we can see it in plain sight. But because we're calling her a healer and things, where I feel like some of us are glossing over the choices, the deliberate choices that she makes. And I don't like that. I don't have it for the both of them. So those are my things.
Okay. You said that last week.
Indeed. Indeed.
She's standing on it. Okay. What else? Who else? Who else want to tell me?
So this is Tina. I was thinking about something. I was thinking about like the time period because I did read these books out of order and the way they were published, the way that they came, you know, in the late 70s and early 80s. I was around and popping. So I read them in that order. One of the things that, and I was thinking back like how I thought about it or how we talked about Doro or what we thought about her. I, at the time, thought she was so brave. My instinct was that she was so brave. That's because women at the time, 1970s, 1975, 78, 10, whatever, it was a new thing for you to be able to have any kind of agency. So up until like 75 or 80 or something, you couldn't get your own mortgage.
Yeah.
You couldn't have your own bank account. You couldn't do a whole lot of stuff. So the frustration I have now as somebody living in 2025 is that, now it's normal for women to be able to like make these choices by themselves, do this stuff, go out, do it, or whatever else. I think that the way that she was written, even though we're talking about centuries and centuries and centuries, is that they're all like, even though she knew she could do things independent, she always acted as if she still needed permission,
Yeah.
or that she's still waiting for the masculine energy or the patriotic you or whatever else to tell her that it was okay.
Yeah.
And that when she defied, and she saw it as being rebellious, she didn't see it as like, I'm claiming myself, I'm my own person. She saw it as being rebellious. That's why she was hiding. That's why she kept putting herself in those situations. So I think that part of what happens with this book is that the sensibilities of when she wrote them and what was happening, you cannot take it out of context, even though with all these different time periods. I think that that's a really different type, like when you go into it. So I remember thinking how brave she was, that she finally kind of like figured out how to do things for herself, because that's how the world was presented to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. I like that you recall when you first read it in your first interaction with the book and how you felt, because when I first read Wild Seed as a master's student, and this was 2012, I felt the same way. I saw no wrong with Anyami. Like, I could find no fault in her at the time, right? But now that I'm reading with my 2025 lens, again, for probably the 10th time, I don't know how many times I've read this book, I find something new every time. Like, I see her
Yes.
differently every time. And I'm like, you're just as complicit in this system because you admitted towards the end that you believed in his vision. You believe,
Yes.
right?
Right. But she wanted him to, like, she believed in it. Like she said, two sides of the same coin. I'm with you, sister. She said but she believed in it, but she wanted him to do it her way. And then she did, and her angst was she didn't know how to make him do it her way.
Because you
That was
can't
it.
make God do something your way, who is God in
Right.
this fashion, right?
Correct. And then the only thing that she came to, and I found this interesting, not only in this book, but the previous book that we read, and Kindred, is that for her, the ultimate sacrifice for these women was to commit suicide.
Yeah, yeah,
Like that's how I take my power, by committing suicide. That's how I get you to do what I want you to do, is I'm going to commit suicide. I have to die in
yeah.
order for you to do right, or do what I think is right.
And you know what's fascinating is when we look at the canon of Black women's writings, suicide is this thing that is frowned upon, right? This is this thing that, Black women don't get to do. And I don't mean like don't get to do like you can't do it. It's you don't have the right to do this thing, Black woman. You don't have the right to delete yourself off this earth. And scholars have wrote extensively about Black women's inability to make a decision on whether they live or die. And we don't see Black women deciding to die a lot in Black women's literature. But in those rare instances, Black women scholars specifically take those female characters to task. So that's a thing.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to share what you thought? Anybody? Because we can hop into my questions. Let me ask y'all this before we hop into my questions, because I know we going all the way around the world. Did this book end like you thought it was going to end?
Yes. And yes, and in order for there to be the future we need both of them. I still stand by. I don't know if it's correct, you're not gonna tell us, but we need both of them because there's a duality to them. They are light and dark, yin and yang, the purpose they serve and what they bring forth with their powers. They I hate to say it because they're so toxic, they need each other. Or maybe if it's an equivalent exchange, the universe needs their balance. What I also thought was that their relationship would look a little different.
Okay.
Meaning, for her, she's such a, I cannot stand her actually. Also, this is a hate account for her as well. For her, as an Aries, for her to just give up and like be willing to die, I did not foresee that because she's so full of energy and spite, and like she's powerful, but she's just willing to like lay down and die. I get it because loss does take a toll, and for her to eventually come around because he weeps, was that enough? No, he is a man at the end of the day. That's not enough. Do you know what I mean? So it did not end how I expected, but I knew they had to come together. Do I think their coming together is resolved? Absolutely not. Because as we talk about like apologies and like the structure of a good apology, we don't see any accountability on his end. I mean, we got a couple words of like as the years passed, but we don't know if he actually really improved over time. And like what also does she have to bear in order for him to grow? There's that saying of like the man that you have is fed off the bones of the women he's hurt. So like she's the women because she lives eternally. Okay. So they get phases of each other. So anyway, okay. I'd like to see where it goes. I don't think they're going to be good together in the long run.
I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on Mind of My Mind next week.
And I'm going to be on time. This is a hate account. Sorry, I'm going to shut it now.
The ending pissed me off clean because I really thought, like, I understand. Okay, how can I put this in words? I understand that there's more books, and so somebody needs to live in order for all of this to progress. But I feel like she already had descendants that she could further her other books with. So the fact that she didn't take her life, which was the ultimate self-sacrifice to that control that Doral had over her, I'm going to talk about her choices in depth. But the fact that she had the opportunity to end it all and stop his control over her and didn't take it, one, as you know, was said because he wept, and two, I just think she just wants to live. She believes in his vision, two sides of the same coin. She just wants to do what she wants to do. And she couldn't picture herself ending it all and not having the opportunity to do that, which again, selfish. I now will piss me off so bad. Like having kids, knowing that he would find her and control her, choices. Like there's so many ways where I'm just like, I don't know how y'all keep for her. I don't get it.
Yeah. When I first read it, I just knew she was going to head out. And I did see Tina says that she got kicked off because she mentioned self-deleting. So we can't say that word. So I don't even know if they're going to let her come back up on the panel or not. And there's no way for me to bring her back up right now. But let's just be careful. We can't use, no. Anyway, I just knew when I first read this book, I was like, yeah, she's going to head out. Like she's tired. She's going to take, her life, and she's done enough. She's tired. And I found it fascinating. Like, why have you lived this long knowing that you could take yourself out of here? You know what I'm saying? Like Doral cannot take himself out. He has to go on living, despite his desire to stop. He has to. But Anyanwu could, right? And so when I turned to the epilogue and read there had to be changes. No, the last paragraph before we get to the epilogue. When Butler is writing, he didn't know that she wiped his face, that, her chest was moving up and down. This love affair, because what makes us uncomfortable is something that we're going to have to reconcile with, that this is a love story between them. Toxic, we can debate that. Unhealthy, sure. But these are two immortals who love one another imperfectly and have decided to go on living because of one another. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. It's something that we don't like to think about because this Someone said this in the chat. So this reminds me of a DV relationship. It does. Mm-hmm. And the fact that he's a Nubian, I know that people found that very hard when I mentioned that last class, that he is still, in essence, a Black man, just like Anyanwu is still, in essence, a Black woman. So at the end of the day, this is a relationship between two Black people having a, dare we say, an unhealthy relationship with one another. So it says toxic soulmates. Okay, we can go there. All right, let's get into the questions, y'all. Pull up the questions. If you're not on the Substack, you should be. That's where the discussion questions are always dropped. I have scheduled Mind of My Mind discussion questions to drop tomorrow morning. So if you want to read those as a guide, read along as a guide as you read, totally fine. So let's go ahead and hop into the discussion questions. I want to talk about reimagining the plantation. This is something that we kind of talked about with Kindred. This is something that we see in Wild Seed and any writer, specifically Black writers, who feel the need to confront the Southern landscape or the plantation. So question 1 says, Wild Seed can be considered a neo-slave narrative. And if you don't know what a neo-slave narrative is, it is basically when Black writers reimagine the landscape of the plantation to kind of give some Black characters more agency than they would normally have if they were enslaved. So this is basically the moment where Black writers are able to rewrite history and reimagine Black people's agency. Okay, so that's what we mean by neo-slave narrative. And the genre became popular or started in the 1960s with Margaret Walker's Jubilee. And then there were several other neo-slave narratives like Ishmael Reed's Flight to Canada, a lot more. But this genre became popularized or was birthed in the 1960s, kind of at the same time that the Black arts movement was happening, and the Black Power movement. Okay, so reimagining the plantation. It says Wild Seed can be considered a neo-slave narrative because it confronts the Southern plantation landscape while reimagining Black women's experiences within it. However, Butler pushes this idea further by allowing Anyanwu to take on the body of a prosperous white Southern planter. And if y'all don't know what a planter is, that's generally what people in the agrarian South refer to as white slave masters, okay? So white Southern planter, where she assumes the role of a plantation owner and houses a group of people who are closer to Doro's vision of Wild Seed. Notably, Butler emphasizes that over time, Anyanwu becomes desensitized to the struggle of Black people on American soil. So here are my questions. What are your thoughts on Anyanwu's transformation? And specifically, I'm talking about her transformation into a white Southern planter or slave owner. And does she remain a victim or does she shift into a new position of power? Let's start with that first question. Y'all think what are your thoughts on her transformation into a white man who could give her white wife girl children? Y'all remember that part?
I think it's another layer for Butler to kind of show us that none of us are exempt and all of us can, given time and circumstance, fit that, like how we're going to talk next about like the telepaths, how all of these people, like we can abuse our power just as easily. We can get accustomed to atrocities just as easily. I know that we all from the outside looking in can recognize things that are wrong, but when we're placed in those positions, will we be any better? And I think she does that at several points in her book, and how she deliberately writes her characters. Everybody's morally gray in a sense, and everybody again has a choice and isn't completely a victim. So I think this is just another step to say, well, when Anyanwu was on the boat looking out on people and was basically aghast at everything that was happening, and her views of slaves and slave masters from time, as time went on, she got accustomed to things, she got used to things, and then she eventually assumed a role. And the fact that she escaped Doro just to become Doro in a different sense, again, it's just saying that nobody is exempt. Like, no matter how good you think you are or how different you might play the situation, I feel like, eventually you'll be this if given the opportunity or whatever the case may be. So we
Yeah.
can't be that harsh, I guess.
And I think we should always remember also to kind of just build on what you were saying is that when she's in Africa, she says one of her husbands says it's better to be own slaves than not be a slave or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And now she actually has the ability to be an enslaver, right? And so while I see someone in the comments says she is surviving and helping her people survive, we may not agree, but she uses what she has. She does not have to be a white man on the plantation in the South. She does not have to. She shifts into this because it's easier, it's more acceptable, right? She wants the privilege that comes along with whiteness. And also I find the fact that she decides her daughter, her white wife didn't want her to, she was hesitant to get pregnant because she didn't want basically black kids. Let's just say what that was. But Anyanwu's ability or willingness to ensure that she did not have black children is problematic to me. Right? Like, you're deciding to be a white man, you're buying black people as property. And of course, you may say, okay, yeah, she's helping them survive, but she was so desensitized as a white person that she wasn't really, she was collecting, as Doro calls her out, she was collecting the people who he wants to collect to. Right?
I think it was also really interesting that even though she now has some level of privilege as being a white man, she's only creating more enslaved people or people who would be property. Like, even though she can have white children now, they're all women and they will all be property to someone else inevitably.
Yeah. And I like that you mentioned that because the first time I read it, I was like, oh, she won't have white male children, because when you're reading slave narratives, it is the white male that is feared the most on the plantation. So she's consciously deleting this white male birth on the plantations. But I do find it problematic that she also decides to mate with this white woman, to live with this white woman, while still in essence a black woman, but wearing this white shell and then completely ignoring a lot of the needs of, the black folks.
So, okay, no, I feel like for me, this was all very jarring. It also reminded me of the Lovecraft Country episode where I can't remember the character's name, but she, took on the body of a white man, and it felt like I felt those same feelings. Like, it was like, if I'm remembering things correctly, reading the book, like Wanyu, she was like really kind of disgusted with, whiteness and the white males and just everything about it. And then for her to make these choices, and especially, I feel like, especially with the pregnancies, it was just the fact that, like, this was a choice.
Yeah.
And there was no, like, I feel like no reasoning behind it to say, like, okay, yeah, I'll give you a child, and then I'll make it even better for you, and they won't be a black child. Was like, you're being very accommodating to the system that you don't have to. Like, you don't have to make these choices. So,
Well, if we're thinking about the times, white women's purity had to be protected, whether they wanted it protected or not. And so her accommodating her white wife is really in line with the Southern sentiment of the time, unfortunately.
I'm glad that's a perfect segue, because I feel like, Tito, I'm about to whoop your ass. Sorry, my cat's on my table. I feel, I feel like I'm gonna push back, because when you read They Were Her Property, the stories around white women who were slave owners, there's like an even more nefarious level to that, right? So for her to marry a white woman and not have white children, I think the words that really resonate with me with Anyanwu is that she is complicit and she's accommodating to the detriment of everyone around her, including herself. Because yeah, she didn't want to have white men, but what do we know about white women and their tears? What do we know about their danger? It's like like instead of it being so overtly like bad, it's more hidden, it's more sneaky. And that to me just reaffirms that she's kind of like all skin folk and kinfolk, because she could have just not, like someone said, she could have just not chosen the skin, and she did. She could have just not married this white woman, and she fell in love with a white woman, which is crazy work as a black woman. And though she didn't give that white woman any children, she could have, but she didn't. And I think about how she was complicit, especially with Doro. She was complicit with her desires to keep him around, to fight to be his wife, to do everything. And then when it came to her child sleeping with her daddy, complicit and accommodating, because she could have wrung his neck as best she could, but she just like growled at him or just made a face at him. So when I think about her and I think about the ways in which she kept up the environment that she was living in and didn't really fight back, it is very much accommodating and complicit at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can see that. Yes. Someone in the chat, I'm reading the chat, I'm listening, I'm trying to navigate. Someone in the chat said, did she know about white women's tears? Probably not. Not in the respect of not in respect to how we think about it today. But black people knew about the dangers of white women. And not just for them to cry wolf, right? Especially black men, when they cry that black men have, you know what I'm saying, the R word. And think about the case of Emmett Till and so many other black men who were hung or had their bodies taken from them because a white woman cried wolf. So while she may not have known white woman tears like we think about it in contemporary culture, she did know about the danger and the power that white women had, especially since white women were subordinate to their white husbands. And so someone else says, I wonder if she would have taken a white wife that didn't have ability. She felt kin to her partly because she was seeing a ghost. Sure, I like that. I like that question. But I also wonder, she married this girl because she wanted to save her, right? How many other black women may have had similar abilities but didn't have proximity to whiteness or considered white or a prize on the plantation might have Anyanwu looked over to privilege this lady? I don't know. Just answering some questions, y'all. We just thinking through it. Okay. Let's think about the second part of this question. Says, how do her actions complicate the traditional victim perpetrator binary? And this is still question one. We're thinking about Anyanwu taking on the body of a white man. I guess we can also think about this in terms of Doro taking on the bodies of white men too. But for this question specifically, I asked, how does her actions wearing the body of a white Southern planter complicate the traditional victim perpetrator binary?
Traditionally, they are at the top of the food chain. White men are at the top of the food chain. So for them to be victim in most situations is not seen that way.
Okay. So do we think traditionally, at first part of this book, some people thought Anyanwu was a victim. Do we think she's a perpetrator now? You two don't let nobody make it.
Correct.
Okay, let me ask y'all this question. What does Anyanwu's forgetfulness suggest about the possibility of black complicity in the structures of American slavery, particularly among those who find themselves in positions of power? This is a loaded question. So let me walk us through it. And those in the chat, y'all feel free to answer. Anyanwu's in this white body. Her black future husband, whom she buys and then has children with because she liked his mental sensitivity, calls her out and basically says, you've been in this white body too long, that you have literally basically closed your eyes to the struggles of Black folks. He calls her out and she says, I needed that, right? She admits that to Doro. The question asks about forgetfulness. And I think it is a very, sometimes it can be, what term am I looking for? I can't even think of it, but it is selective, right? Selective forgetfulness. So I'm asking, what does Anyanwu's forgetfulness while she's in a white body suggest about the possibility of Black complicity in structures of American slavery, particularly among those who find themselves in positions of power? So I'm asking, do you think there is a chance that somehow Black folks could have been complicit in the legacy or in the continuation of slavery in some type of way? That's a hard question.
Very hard question. Very hard question. We can take it to before they even got on the boat with people who sell their own. But I really do think that in that regard, they didn't know the extent of how they would be chatteled and bred, because that's not how slavery worked among the Arabs when they came and, pillared and, wars happened, they took slaves, whatever the case may be. Slavery has been around since this version of it. But I don't think they knew to what extent. So they were complicit, but I do put a caveat there, right? Again, doesn't make it right, whatever the case may be, but they were complicit. And now we're going to, you're making your rounds and then finally landing in the Americas. Some people were complicit out of survival. Some people were again, not excusing that they did what they did. But I don't know. I think it's hard because there's a lot of nuance there to just put it as yes or no. And then again, not explain the content. So yes, were they complicit? Yes. But there's things surrounding it.
And I'm not just referring to before we got here, because we know that the American slavery system was the worst. We do know that people practiced enslavement and there were indentured servant things of that nature. Indentured servitude, that's what I mean. But when I'm thinking about complicit, I'm thinking about the dynamics on the plantation, where you had the house and the field, the house ninja and the field ninja. You had people who were also overseers, Black folks who also were overseers, but because they wanted a certain privileges from the master, right? They, in a lot of ways, they either went and told. Remember when we were in Kindred and someone told on Dana? Why did the lady tell on Dana, right? She wanted this privilege, or she wanted certain treatment from this master. And so this is a tough question, because yes, they're all slaves or enslaved, but everyone was not enslaved the same way. Mm-hmm. And there were there were tiers of ranking of bodies, right? If we're thinking about whose body is worth more, Black folks in slave narratives and in fiction, we see this over and over again, that there were some people who sold out their own kind for the master's privileges from the master. And they're selling out their skin to them does make them complicit in a way.
Yeah, I think that it is everything in life is nuanced, right? But I do think that, like you said, there is a level of complicity, and it was for protection. And I also think that over the course of time, like was mentioned in Kindred, there is a dulling of the senses. So when you don't see yourself as a human and you don't see those around you as a human, presume that, I'm talking about the people on the plantation, right? Presume that it would be easier for you to essentially sell them out to your owner and do things that you would not do if you valued the human life in front of you and your own personal human life. And that is, I guess, a forced complicity, but it is still relevant. You know what I mean? Because the mind does have to do a lot of bending and twisting to sustain that fight or flight that is being a slave day in, day out. We saw it with Kendra. We saw how she was like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. And I also think if you even go back further, like was mentioned by Tachi earlier, like the selling, because you don't know what's on the other side. But I'm gonna push back on that because they heard. After a while, the Africans heard what was happening and they knew what was happening, and they still said, keep pushing them along because we're getting money for this. And that is complicit as well. And there is still the point of, you do not value the human life. You rather value the money that you are getting for sending these, your people or people you have captured, across the water. And though they may die, and you know a lot of them do die, you continue to do it. And that to me is also something that has to be spoken to, right? And I think, especially when we come to forgetfulness, memory is plastic. You can't hold on to a thing for long. Eventually the mind kind of has to, we take on too much data. We have to kind of to accept what we can and push out the rest. And so that forgetfulness comes from the combination of like dulling, and I don't perceive you as a person through and through, or I don't value myself, and I am beholden to this white man and his money, and we end with this stacked view. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It becomes this, I was gonna say gamification, but I don't think that's what I want to use. I don't want to finish that term. It becomes a survival of the fittest type of game that happens, right? And I see in the chat that we are trying to give every reason why they may be complicit, but the question was yes or no.
I said yes, and I stand 10 toes down. I mean, it contains nuance, but yes, they were
Not on the panel. In the chat, I just want us to not do a lot of mental gymnastics, right? To try to make it sound better. Yes or no? Were they complicit in their decision making? Because if we don't take some type of ownership, not saying that we have to take full ownership, but every person had a role to play, whether they decided to revolt, where they decided to stay in line. Everyone had a role to play. And today we all have roles to play, right? So some of us are complicit in systems when you're silent about, I think there's this quote that people say, Zora Neale Hurston said, but no one can find it. If you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you liked it. That's showing you're complicit, right? You were silent. They're going to say you liked it because you didn't say anything, right? And so I think ultimately it is a hard question to ask, but when we get down to the nitty gritty of it, Black folks have historically always sold each other out. We can see it through history, right? So once we take that responsibility and be like, okay, as we said before, we came to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade, Black people were selling other Black folks, even if they were slavery kind of functioned differently in Africa, right? Some of them were prisoners of war. Some of them were working off debts, things of that nature. But when they came to the Americas, it turned into something different because on American soil, you cannot enslave another human, which is why they had to dehumanize Black people to see them as non-human in order to enslave them. Because after all, this is a Christian country, right? All right, I think this gets us into a good segue. Let's go ahead and talk about transition and transformation. This is question 2. We're gonna probably get through 3 questions tonight, and I'm proud of us. It says, transition is often described as a movement from one state of being to another. So for instance, from powerless to power. But we can also consider transitions from ignorance to awareness or from survival to dominance. While transitions are frequently marked by fear and discomfort, Butler presents Doro's transformation as particularly traumatic. Why do you think Butler deliberately delays the details of Doro's transition? And how might Doro's experience serve as a broader metaphor for spiritual awakenings, forced adaptation, or the painful cost of transformation? Let's go to the first question. Says, why do you think Butler deliberately delays the details of Doro's transition? Like, I felt sympathy for Doro when I found out how he transitioned. Did y'all?
Yeah, I feel like up until that point, I had zero sympathy for him. I feel like it definitely, it definitely made me look at him a little bit differently. It switched my perspective on him a little bit differently because it I don't know, for whatever reason it clicked for me like, damn, he really can't. This is who he is. Accept me for who I am,
Yeah.
or don't accept me at all. And so when I started to really look at it through that lens, it was just like, I mean, well, what can you do?
You can't do anything. And if you all forgot, the chat is saying absolutely not. They had no sympathy for Doro. But if y'all forgot what happened in that moment, let me just tell you, he's sick, right? He is the last of his mother's children who survived. Everyone else died. I don't know if I can say that word. Anyway, last of his mother's children. He gets sick. He's laying in her lap. Next thing you know, he looking down at himself and he in his mama body. He don't know how he transferred. He is shook. Okay. He in his mother's body. He gets up. He's, probably flailing and panicking and all the other stuff going on. His father comes in before he can explain. Now he in his daddy body. Then he goes mad. We find out that he's in Egypt. He's in jail. It's a whole thing. I know we don't like Doro, but if you happen to be in your mother's body, 1 second you in your body, the next second in your mother's body, the next second in your daddy body. Come on, y'all.
I understand what you're saying, but last week I had already said that Doro definitely gives Dracula, and that there is a horrific transition that happens, and that yes, nobody should be able to, like, his experience is traumatic, right? And so is transitioning from being a human to a vampire. Nobody wants that. Nobody welcomes that, right? So I already knew his background was pretty messed up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care though. Choices. I don't
Okay.
have any sympathy for him.
Okay. Why do y'all think Butler delayed it? Because it came late.
Because she knew we would have that sob story, and boy, oh boy, would people be like, oh, dang, poor boy. And actually, as a Doro hate account fan, let me tell you something. I get having your moment, and it's rough, and you're popping through bodies left and right, Highlander, whatever you want to call it. You wake up 50 years later, who did it and what for? Yeah. When you are yourself fully for the first time in half a century, and you proceed to decide, oh, I'm going to be a bad guy, that's when we have to have a conversation, because I'll give you the grace of, this is a boy, this is a child, and he's going through something very traumatic. Okay, I'll give you, he's a teenager, puberty, so on and so forth. And there's something to be said about him still proceeding down the path of non-righteousness. And I can't rock with that.
I'm with you on that, because that's where he lost me. Because, like I said, I'm gonna say I didn't have. At first, I had zero sympathy, but I understood him a little bit more. But I think it was at one point in the book where he was like, he like switched from like a slave master or something to a free black man, and I was like, well, what was that for? Why'd you have to go do that? It's the choices for me, and I couldn't get down with them.
And I also feel like, who are you mad at? Because no one did this to you, right? Specifically, when you have a villain origin story, somebody did something to you and that's why you're mad, right? But you can't pinpoint somebody. So why are you sitting there going and terrorizing people living their lives? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
I think there's also a delayed background story for him, because to me personally, I felt like now I can see how Anyanwu can end up being just like Doro. because they have the same sort of want at the end of it all, is they all want belonging, and they want someone who's going to be there with them for however many lifetimes they decide to keep on living. And so I think if Ayanwu lives a few more lifetimes, she could end up becoming Doro and becoming so apathetic to loss and destruction and having to start over and over and over again that she can lose a lot of that humanity that we see in her now. And so I think we needed that dichotomy.
Yeah, and I also want to remind us, thanks for saying that, Bree. Bree Reeds. I want to remind us that I think his transition happened at 13, and that is where he stopped. Right. And there's that conversation where she's like, you died, and he's like, I didn't die, like that conversation about death, and he's like, no, but that is where he stopped maturing. So we're ultimately dealing with the maturity of a 13-year-old in godlike fashion. And I'm going to say this as a spoiler. It's not even a spoiler. It's just an aside that's in Butler's notes, and I want y'all to tuck this away for next week. Butler says that Mary is what Doro would have been had he not died. Okay, so I just want y'all to hang on to that this protagonist that we're about to encounter next week is the female version of what Doro should have been. Okay, when we're thinking about transition, though, and I want to kind of bring us out of the transition conversation from specifically focusing on Doro, because we all go through transitions in life. All of us are transitioning consistently, right? And those are, if I'm being honest, when I'm transitioning from one phase of life to another, arguably, that is the most dangerous time of my life because everything is unstable. I'm moving. I'm not who I was. I'm becoming someone else, so I'm not fully sure that I am. And so my identity is shaky in the middle. Like, I don't know if y'all have ever had those moments. You may not have had them in life, but if you're transitioning from being a student or from elementary school to high school, from high school to college, like there is this upgrade that happens, but you're always shaky in the upgrade because you are in a state of becoming. So with that in mind, my question says, how might Doro's experience serve as a broader metaphor for spiritual awakenings, forced adaptation, or the painful cost of transformation? Because we all pay a cost when we're transitioning, right? Whether it be from powerless to power, from one age to another, you pay a price to become who you were created to be. You pay a price when you become a mother, if you become a father, if you become a wife, if you become a husband, right? You have to pay a price. And sometimes it is a painful price. So I'm wondering, did y'all catch that as a metaphor for spiritual awakenings, forced adaptation, or the painful cost of transformation?
I think how I took it, well, looking specifically at Doro's transformation and taking it, looking at it with a step back in terms of transitioning, I think there is a cost when you get stuck in limbo. Like we've been talking about his maturity and how he's basically stuck as a 13-year-old. But his body has matured. He's taken the world in as he matured, but his sensibilities and how he makes decisions and how he goes about things is still that of a 13-year-old. So you can choose. I think a lot of people get stuck in transition. So because you can either, stay there or fly, but it's going to happen. Just like, okay, to use your metaphor, when you go from high school to college. Like that's going to happen, whether you like it or not, because you prep for it, whatever the case may be, that you can still take your mindset from high school into college, right? You can choose to grow with everyone else and learn and adapt, especially in your sensibilities and your personality and all that other stuff. So you really can choose, you really can choose to either do the work and, navigate this weird, frightening time, or you can get stuck where you are because that's familiar. And I do think that, I don't know, him going mad was kind of like some of it being, I guess, showcased there, and the fact that he just doesn't mature mentally, even though he's a bajillion years old. That's how I take it.
Yeah, and I like that you said that, because it kind of points to the fact that someone can stop maturing and still have a lot of power, and then, as someone in the chat just said, it feels like a cautionary tale, right? Age is not synonymous with maturity, and no one who acts childish should have that much power at all. Anybody else want to go?
I have 3 thoughts. The first thought is, my friend's therapist said that, to your point earlier about like the age you experience the trauma is the age that you stop at. And so, yes, I do agree that this is a 13-year-old boy who is 3,000 plus years old. And I think I think her name is Tiffany Nicole, raised a good point that he also doesn't get to settle. And so if we talk about spiritual awakenings, there is like not an ebb and flow, but there is a crest. You're supposed to experience the fullness of the awakening. And that is like you have your down, and then you have the peak, or the, not exaltation, but the experience. And then you come back. But he's never got to experience the come back down, which is he continues to have to jump. And so, to Tiffany's point about like going from body to body, he doesn't get to rest. He never gets to be easeful and slow and experience the full beginning and end of the thing. And I think that lends itself to the conversation around how much pain he is carrying. This is still a hate account, by the way. But how much pain he is carrying, because there is a cost associated with constant transformation. The body, the mind, it's not supposed to do this so much. You're not supposed to have a spiritual awakening or a forced adaptation every couple of days, weeks, months, years. It's not built for that. And even though he is a God or a spirit or an entity, he didn't start out that way. So he doesn't have those parameters or guardrails in place to keep him. And even those gods that we know from books and movies, they do not go through what he is going through. So unfortunately, and this will sound like I like him, he is showing us that you have to have your moment of rest. You need the moment to actually heal and recover. And I don't know if he ever gets there, because we haven't made it to the book yet. But he needs the moment to recover, and he doesn't get that. He's constantly in a state of agitation. And if you are awakening something, like the word itself, awakening, means you were asleep. He doesn't get to sleep. So we know what happens when you don't sleep. Your body falls apart. Hence, his mind is, this is not a fan for me, but this is a hate account. So I think he also represents for us, for a broader metaphor around why it is important to also go through the trauma onto the other side, and what happens when you stay in that state of agitation, and how that your internal tornado can impact those around you at whatever age the trauma happens, and it ripples out, and the consequences bear fruit years and years down the line. And unfortunately, he gets to see the results of his years and years down the line, because he's partaking in it as well.
I want to piggyback off of that, because he also cuts short other people's transitions. So remember when Joseph came to the house, and he was just like, I don't want to tell anybody that I'm transitioning because he killed my brother. And like, that's what happened to him. So as soon as he feels like they're turning for the worse, he doesn't let them fully, do what they're supposed to do before he decides, oh no, this is a waste, I'm just going to kill them. So I just want to
Because you don't want somebody to grow past you, because he's a hater.
No, y'all. There's a reason for that.
I think he also can live longer in a body than he's choosing to. Like there's a scene towards the end where he's like, oh yeah, this man's body, I can be in this for about a year or two. Like he can choose to live in a body longer than he does, but he has selfish reasons as to why he transitions as much as he does. And that really has to do more with control. So I think if he relinquished a lot of this control, he wouldn't have to be in as much transition.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna ask you both of y'all. I have to clarify on Joseph, right? So there is a certain time where people, and specifically the telepaths, are supposed to go through transition. Joseph historically was too old. We'll see this come up again. They'll be called latents in Mind of My Mind. These are people who have budding powers, but their bodies never push them, or their spirits never push them through transition, because he can't control their transitions. Their own bodies have to initiate the transformation process. And so for Joseph, he should not have been able to transition, so he transitioned late. Butler is literally foreshadowing something in Mind of My Mind. Also, I want to let y'all know that the reason he does not let them live long is because once they get to unruly telepaths, think about Leo's ability. Think about what happened when when the Wike was transitioning, how her mind broke. They literally turn into mad dogs. They literally turn into feral things that can snatch your mind. So remember I said in the post on the Substack, they are mind hunters. They're soul snatchers. They can break your body, break your mind. So the telepaths are dangerous. So he does cut them down prematurely if they show signs of being destructive, because these are the people who he can't necessarily control like that. Bree reads, what did you say, girl? I wanted to clarify what you said. Oh, girl in the body. So sometimes he is transitioning selfishly, but there are sometimes that his body forces him to go take another body. Like when he took Anyanwu's daughter's body, he didn't need to take her body. He just said, I'm bored with her. She served her purpose. That's when Anyanwu was like, I didn't had enough with you. But there are moments when he's like, I gotta go. I cannot stay in this body, because maybe the body is not strong enough to keep him. Maybe something traumatizing, or he's sensing something that's going to force him to jump out of the body, right? And so on the one hand, yeah, sometimes he's just selfish and he wants to teach someone a lesson. On the other hand, his spirit demands that he body jumps. Okay.
This is still a head count.
Okay. All right. I can't argue with it. All right. Let's jump down to cultural memory and the body as an archive. Cultural memory and the body as an archive. The question says, Anyanwu attempts to reconcile the forced dislocation of Black bodies by gathering and preserving people as Doro does. She expresses this connection through a powerful statement. Then this is what she says. Their bodies will remember me down to the smallest structures of their flesh. You cannot know how well people's bodies remember their ancestors. Her words resonate with contemporary discussions on epigenetics and emotional memory, which is the idea that trauma is not just experienced in the moment, but passed down biologically, culturally, and psychologically. So my question is, how does Anyanwu's assertion about bodily memory align with scientific arguments about epigenetics, which suggests that external experiences can alter genetic expression and persist across generations? Let's go with that question first.
I love this question because I love epigenetics ever since learning about it over a decade and a half ago. I think, because I don't think it was a topic for science back in the 70s, this is a very prescient take for this book, and also just the conversation in general, given the fact that it has been proven now that, especially thanks to Butler, but it's been proven now that there is an on and off switch. Our epigenetics means just sits on top of the genes. And so we see that, especially in children. They've done it in studies with twins. You separate the twins, they still have the same gene expression. So if your dad is an alcoholic, you're likely to be an alcoholic. If your dad is a smoker, even if you don't grow up in the house with them, et cetera, et cetera. And so for that statement, I saw that and I was like, oh my gosh, yes. For Butler to give this notion before there was even science to prove it is powerful, because we know that we are our ancestors living. We experience in our bodies the same traumas and triggers and excitement that they have. And the body does keep the score, or Grandmother's Hands if you prefer that book. And with the body keeping the score, if we put that on a Doro and an Anyanwu and what that can mean for their children, I was thinking, because we haven't got there yet, thousands of years from now, when we're in the future, the choices that they made in the 14, 15, 1600s is going to play out with their children. And I wonder how that will shape the environment that they are in. And maybe we'll see it in LA. Maybe we don't have to jump that far ahead, but maybe we'll see it in LA. And particularly around genetic expression and the persistence of it, that also means that how their children who get to grow up past a 13-year-old boy who's constantly moving bodies, they will also struggle with dealing with their feelings and feeling constantly in a state of unease and catalyst and having to transition terribly. Or they'll be like their mom and accommodating and complicit. And how we just, if we tie this back to the conversation around like, why are we so complicit? Well, we have to be. It's in our genes at this point. We have to smile in the white man's face and come home and tell Nikki Giovanni like why the cracker pissed us off. You know what I mean? We have to do that, even though we don't want to. And so it is a level of unlearning, which I think we'll get to in the book, in the future books, that requires like a concerted effort. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult because you are fighting against your genes. You are fighting against history at this point. And you're David to Goliath, mm-hmm. especially for his children, for Adoro, a powerful entity. Like, what could that manifest itself as time progresses? That's my thoughts.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up the David and Goliath reference, because I was going to talk about ultimately, if you are in the Christian faith, you probably heard of generational curses, and these are things passed down through the bloodline. Also, even if you don't want to think about it in a religious way, when you go to the doctor, they're asking you about the medical history of your family, because these things, you know how people say, this ran in my family, this ran in my family, right? It is through the bloodline. It is through the gene expression, right? And so if y'all don't know, because I should have read this before, epigenetics suggests that outside factors can influence internal changes, which persist even after the agent or event is gone. And when I mentioned emotional memory, I got that from a quote from Toni Morrison in one of her essays. And she says that emotional memory is what the nerves and skin remember, as well as how it appears. So you don't even have to be there for it to show up on your body. Have y'all ever read Phyllis Alicia Perry Stigmata? That is some type of representation of emotional memory, or how epigenetics shows up physically on a protagonist whose great grandmother was enslaved, and how this great grandmother ancestor refuses to let her live her life, arguably, because she wants to ensure that she remembers. And so for the protagonist in that book, she literally weeps from whips that her grandmother experienced show up on her body. And then they send her to a mental institution because they think she's self-harming, and she's really not. This is kind of the manifestation of epigenetics, or emotional memory, showing up on the descendants of the enslaved.
I want to throw some biochem since we're talking about epigenetics. You know, I always come through. But if we think about epigenetics and we think about something called telomeres, this is everything you guys said. Everything you guys said, yes, right?
The shortening of the telomeres.
Yes, I'm going to, girl. I got you.
Yes, y'all. We didn't know.
My whole thing is that with epigenetics, again, real quick recap, we have genes, right? As we go throughout time, our genes kind of cover the things that we use, and they uncover things that we don't use. And it's based on our survival, which is like epigenetics, why certain things get passed down. So if any trauma is involved and things like that, certain genes are heightened and other ones are turned off. Cool. My point about the telomeres is it takes years and eons of that trauma being passed down from generation to generation. And then that comes on us, and then everything our ancestors kind of carried with them kind of lands on us, right? The thing about it is that frightens me is that before somebody decides to pivot and heal, your DNA is shrinking, meaning with the shrinking of your telomeres, you could be cutting off those good genes that you need to turn back on in order to break these things. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is, at what I don't know if she's going to allude to this in her future books, but I just think of it in terms of biochem and medicine, how short life is and how much work that we, I don't know, as a collective body need to recognize and do in order to ensure that, you know, we still have the good genes to turn on. You can still turn on these things and not perpetually live in this survival mode and pass things down.
I like this, and I want anyone interested with the biochem in mind, with the genetic conversation, the genes conversation or genetic conversation we're having in mind. If anybody was interested in how that shows up in her works, you need to go to the Xenogenesis trilogy, Dawn,
Okay.
Imago, Adulthood Rights.
That's on my list.
Okay, hold on. Could you put it in the chat?
Yeah, I'm about to type it out because it's on my list. Spank, I'm about to type it out right now. We've got to read it.
Once we finish this trilogy, the next trilogy or the next series you should read is the Parables, Parable of the Sword, Parable of the Talents. When we finish Parable of Talents, which we're going to all read, I'm going to take a week break. But when we finish this, then you go to Dawn, Imago, Adulthood Rights. That is the Xenogenesis trilogy, or what's called Lilith's Brood. What a lot of people forget is that the Oankali are gene traders, right? And so once you get away from how grotesque they look and things that they may do that you may think are immoral, you notice that they are health cures, right? They cure health crises. They took away Lilith's cancer, right? And regenerated her genes, right? Because she did have it. And so if you're looking through a lens of biochem, biology, genetic, all you want to have those scientific conversations, Dawn is your book. Okay.
We in there.
We stuck like Chuck.
Yeah, and you can only see the evolution of this text once you finish this Parable of the Talents. And one thing you have to think about is, like, now we're in smart cities in the Xenogenesis trilogy. Now we have smart agriculture, things that we are advancing towards now or trying to advance towards. They all show up in Butler's work from the 90s. Okay, so she was well above her time. Okay, well before her time. My next 30 Wednesdays are now booked. Okay, so let's get into, there's another part to this question. Do traumas and histories reside only in the individual body, or are they passed down through collective cultural memory and genetic inheritance? I'm really interested in the cultural memory aspect.
I'm going to say yes. I'm going to make it real quick because I know Bria, Michaela, like, girl, like, we've been tag teaming because we're a hate account. But real quick, yes, because you need so back to the chem for a minute, biochem, the genetic expression it happens because of what your environmental factors impress upon you. So again, if you're stressed out and you're drinking more, so you need that environment because nothing happens in a vacuum in order for the epigenetics to take place. So the collective memory piece of this comes into play because now we're saying that we all collectively experience a thing. We may experience it differently. We may react to it differently, but we all experience it together. And we share that experience. So as a generation, as a society, as a group of people. And so for the collective piece, when we see that played out through generations, it's like passed down mother to child or father to child. It's the stories we tell ourselves. And it's also internally how our bodies react to those experiences. Because the story we'll tell ourselves, for example, if we say, my grandmother was a mammy. She cleaned a white person's house, right? And she experienced white racism in Mississippi. My mom was desegregating her schools. She experienced that. So she tells me what my grandma did. She tells me what she experienced. And then I go in nothing against Mississippi. Don't say too much. I'm gonna get mad. And then I experienced racism, not just in Mississippi, but across, the U.S. And so I know the collective memory of my parents or my matriarchs. And I also know genetically that if I see a white person smile at me, I know they're probably thinking something sneaky. Or if I see a white woman who moves her hand too weakly, I know that on a subconscious level. And so it's both things at once because they play off each other. And so if I were to say to my child that I would never have, hey kid, you have to fight back against this preconceived notion on what you assume of this group of people, the child will say yes. However, somewhere in the back of their minds, they'll still be having that thought, and they may not be able to place why that thought exists, but they'll have that because there's two things happening. Do you know what I mean? So all in all, it is a combination of both, and you cannot separate the two because you should never separate the two. They play on each other, and they are just as important together as they are separately.
Okay. I think so too. I think one of the things that I grapple with is the idea, the cultural memory aspect, right? I do think we need to know, and I do think we need to know where we come from because, history repeats itself. We have all of these sayings, and history is important, and you do need to know your history. But then I wonder, at what point does continuing to replay the history kind of stagnate the growth of the future generations? Like, at what point is it okay to say, this is your history, it's okay for you to move on, as opposed to keep replaying and reminding and remembering? This is something that Black women authors struggle with as well, especially when you think about Toni Morrison's concept of rememory. And it's basically, this is part of the question that I have here, so we can jump in it. It's the question that says historical trauma and rememory. And it says, Toni Morrison defines rememory as the act of recollecting and remembering, as in reassembling the members of the body, the family, the population of the past. So it's generally the act of remembering a memory, okay? She uses the term to describe how personal and collective histories continue to haunt the present. With Morrison's definition in mind, how does loyalty serve as an act of rememory, particularly regarding the Middle Passage, forced displacement, and the erasure of African cultures? And here's what I mean by, I want to kind of say or clarify what I mean by collective histories continue to haunt the present. It can get exhausting. Like, you all know, if you followed my account, you know that I taught African American literature. That's what my training was in. And in order to get hired, I had to be responsible for literature from the 1600s up until the present day. Like, I had to know the whole canon. So I can take you through a history lesson. But every semester that I'm continuing to teach this survey course of African American literature, and we have to talk about enslavement, it gets exhausting, right? The mental toil of continuing to go over and over and over again. Yeah, I should be teaching this stuff, but emotionally, I noticed a toil, like a wearing, a tearing away at my resolve or my ability to push past this, because I keep going back to remember, or keep going back to arguably live in the experience of the people who have written about the experience, right? And so when I noticed the fatigue of continuing to teach that literature, specifically semester after semester, and sometimes twice a semester, I had to stop. I had to stop, as someone said, re-traumatizing. I had to step away from the literature because it was wearing on me, a present day person who thinks that history is important, but wonders, is there a line that we should draw? And is it even possible to draw a line? I don't know.
I think I definitely agree with Maisha. She put in the chat how we kind of can mitigate this is by teaching about cultures and ancestries prior to slavery in the Middle Passage, because it wasn't all like, if Anyanwu's story was told like when she was in on it, and how the markets looked and all these other things, and how society was arranged, and all the folk tales, and actually people living and people being in community, how they were before being meddled with. And again, I put those in brackets because Africa was always being meddled with, but prior to when everybody else came. But I feel like if we have instances to look at when people weren't being just seen as carnage, I feel like we can kind of balance the two. I do completely get what you're saying about the exhaustion, and how, I don't know, it takes a toll after a while. I remember when I was going through, I was learning about something, and I just got to work and I just couldn't stand looking at white people. And it's because I was learning, and it's just like, okay, well, how do we separate the two if we keep going back? And I don't know, I guess reading about works when it wasn't just that, I think have helped me And me being, I guess, a descendant of people who weren't enslaved in that way. So I get histories and I get to look at, stories and folk tales from that time when people weren't being treated that way or perceived in that. It kind of helps me do things. And I don't know, that's why sometimes as an African, I'll be shutting up. I'll be shutting up as an African, not an African American, because I totally get it. And I have, I guess, a certain privilege or awareness that, you
Americans
don't get sometimes. And so I just be letting y'all do y'all big one because it's important. And I don't know, it's jarring and it takes a toll on you when that's all you're taught.
Yeah.
I don't
And
think this.
go ahead,
Oh,
Bree.
sorry. I don't think this really answers your question, but when you were talking, it was drawing parallels for me with Doro and how I think that he's kind of going through that same process of like he's re-traumatizing himself because he's trying to get back to that origin point of like having a family and having that sense of community and belonging, and he keeps trying and failing with all of his breeding programs and all of these things that he's doing. And I think it just re-traumatizes him and he's not able to move forward.
Yeah, and I think that I don't know, and I'm not negating that educating ourselves on who we were before, like the kings, the queens, like I get all of that, and I also value Afrofuturism that kind of nods back to those moments of let's reimagine, let's go back to this moment where Black folks weren't always on American soil and treated as subhuman. I think my only hesitancy with that being a antidote is that not an antidote, that being the cure is that the span of information once we hit America is so long and still ongoing that I think that it's kind of hard to kind of stay in that pre-American life and the Afrofuturist imagination because of the time span that's in the middle. But I think the middle, even if we're not thinking about history or this book, the middle always takes people out. Think about if you're trying to journey, you're trying to get from one place. It is where people die in the middle, right? And this is where people give up, and this is where you fatigue, and this is where you're tired, and this is where it doesn't feel like it's going to work out. If you're trying to reach a goal, it's that middle, right? And so I do see the value of knowing who we could have been or should have been before we became enslaved. But I don't know if that is going to, be the medicine.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard because I think it's important definitely to remember, our history to understand because it's helped to shape who we are. It's helped for us to make some of the decisions that we make. But it's also a lot on your emotional state and your emotional being. Like I saw somebody in the chat saying like, oh, I don't even watch any like slave narrative type of movies, and I feel them on that because it's just like, okay, I get it. I feel like everybody kind of gets to a point where they're like, okay, I understand it. I get it. I know our history, I know our people, but I need to move forward. I've got to take the next step. I've got to live. I've got to like keep the story going in essence. But I think that's what we're all trying to figure out is how do we do that?
And there's no right answer, right? We don't have the answer. This is why we're just going in a circle and just kind of thinking through it because also what may work for me may not work for you all, right? It
Yeah.
may not
Yeah.
because we're all different. We're all like, what's your name? Hachi?
Tachi. Tachi.
Tachi, thank you. Like Tachi said, she said something that reminded me of what this pastor said, y'all. This ain't a sermon, but I got to tell you because what she mentioned was she has a privilege that we don't have, right? She has this ancestral awareness. Am I putting words in your mouth?
No.
Okay. So she has this, she doesn't have that struggle. So I heard this story years ago. It always stuck with me. It's this pastor, black man, goes to Africa. He gets in the car. You know how sometimes you say things before your mouth know you said it?
Mm-hmm.
And you try to catch it, but the words are already out. It's too late. You can't catch them. They ran away. So this pastor, he's in his car. He's in Africa. I don't know where, but he gets in the car and he has this African driver. And something made him say, I didn't care much for Africans. And so the driver is like, oh, why is that? And so the pastor's in the back, like, because y'all seem to be so snooty and, be so uppity. And the driver says, we're not snooty or uppity. We're what you would have been had you not been slaves.
I wouldn't have said that.
First off, because I like to hang on people, so that's crazy that you would say that to me.
True, but that's not a lie either, right?
I mean, two things can coexist, absolutely, and I'm still gonna yank your head between. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Don't yank nobody's head, but it's true. When enslavement teaches Black folks a certain way of life. And what this man was saying was, we're none of that. We are what you should have been, or we are still what you were. Had you not gone through this institution, and now your genes are maybe expressing differently, or you've been taught to act a certain way, to do a certain thing to survive. We didn't have to do that here. But because you've had to morph into something less than, now you see us, or you try to demonize our pride.
Okay, I want to mitigate this because I don't want this to be diaspora wars. This is not okay. So what I'm trying to say is that, I don't know. I feel as though, how can I say this? Because that entire scenario is how conflicts arise here between the two cultures, right? Somebody says something, doesn't think, somebody retorts and says something that doesn't think, and everybody's they're not saying what they mean because of the tension in the time, right? Yeah. So I feel like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I know something different, and the history, I was taught two histories at the same time, and I was privileged to have a dad who was a historian, a dad who served in the Biafran War, which was the Nigerian Civil War, and then beyond that was passed down, folklores and things that were passed down from his father, and so on and so forth. It's not about sunshines and rainbows, right? I don't want to depict that Africa, like everybody in Africa is on the up and up and nobody struggles and this is what it's supposed to look like, or any of that. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's just that there was never a time that we weren't seen as human. There was never a time back then where the skin color was the determining factor of the hierarchy. It wasn't that.
Sure.
It was cunning, it was intelligence, it was other things. So yeah. I happen to know that. And so when a lot of us now come and immigrate in the US, they don't understand that aspect of things. And or they don't look at it as a lens or a barrier to things. Because well, what do you mean? I'm smart.
Let me say this in the chat, y'all. This is not America versus Africa, okay? And yes, they did experience different versions of colonialism. Yes, I am just making a statement by telling you that story. Don't get your panties in a bunch. Saying that there is a sense of pride that in this story, what the pastor was trying to say or to convey is that there is a sense of African pride that people who did not undergo American slavery still have, that Black folks who underwent it do not have.
And I will say I totally get that. I still will knock his head between the washer and dryer, and because we contain multitudes, you know what I mean? I'm clearly aware. And so what I think of when I hear a story like this is that we talk about catalyst and forced adaptation, right? And this is a great example because you have, she knows a little bit about science. You've got two experiments, right? You've got the test subject or the control, and then you have the test, right? So the control would be Africa, or in this instance, if we tie it back to the book, the test would be, well, I don't know, Doro, right? Or maybe, you know what, switch that, Anyamu. She would be the test because she underwent a transformation as well. She just went about hers a little differently. And then you have Doro, or the Black American, who is in a constant state of transition because technically we are and have been since landing on this soil. We have gone through 3 wars, a revolution, a civil, and two great world wars. And we are constantly having to find ourselves within ourselves and in this larger environment that does not want us around, yet can't seem to divest themselves from us because they need us. It is a parasitic relationship at best, and there are other words I can't say without getting banned at worst. And so when you look at these two people, right, and I guess the parasites for Doro would be like his family, like he breeds them, but then he uses them, and whatever the case may be. If we continue that thought pattern of like, okay, sure, or continue the thought experiment and say, okay, sure, there's a forced adaptation in a transitionary state that you can't come out of. What does that yield you? You get a being that drives forth progress, because we know, we haven't read it yet, some of us, but we know that we get to about 2,000 years or so in the future, and the world and the universe has been shaped by Doro because he's been in a transitory state, and he has essentially impacted the world and the universe around him so that it also changes. So if we tie this back to that man that knocked between the washer and dryer, that pride that he feels about being the test and untouched would lend itself to like, yeah, that's great. And what we experience as Black Americans, because, the saying is the world doesn't move without Black culture. It is true. Nothing would be American without us, and nothing but the world, the culture, would be without us. And so we can then see that catalyst that has to keep happening for Doro is terrible, and it yields progress forth. Now, again, we contain multitudes, and two things can coexist at the same time. I do wonder if we were to then, if this conversation had been continued and the man who was the American had said, well, yes, you do get to experience this world, but at the cost of you not being in my seat, because it could have been you that was the American and me the African, or this could not have happened at all if you, Africa, your ancestors, had not sold your fellows, and none of this transition would happen. None of this progress would happen. None of this would happen. And so I wonder then what that means on a collective memory, a collective or societal level of like, yes, you have to go through the thing to get to the other side. Yes, at what cost? And what does it yield? It yields a progress that is very uncomfortable, very forthcoming in change, and very resilient. Both sides, both the African man and the American man have experienced a resilience. Now it does look a little differently, but it is a resilience, and it could not have happened if not for that selling of a sort. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and I want to, because I'm looking at the chat, y'all. Okay, I just want.
That's what I'm saying. I didn't want to say again. Okay, so I'm seeing the
Let
colonialism.
me do it. I got it. Let's be clear. In academia, in classes, people, we are having a discussion. I don't want y'all to take none of this to heart, going back and forth. It don't make no sense, right? In academia, in a classroom, we're having a conversation. We're not ganging up on nobody. We're not saying this person is right, this person is wrong. We have to get comfortable with engaging thoughts. Now, me bringing up the pastor and the taxi driver, we have to also consider that this person came from the pastor, who is very well known. If I say his name, you'll know him, is coming from a place of privilege. Why would you say that, right? For what? Well, it don't make no sense, right? He had no reason to say that to that man. Therefore, the taxi driver had the right to defend himself, or to say what he wanted to say. It was all love between them. Just like me telling this story, y'all, it's all love. This is not us going back and forth.
Because who we really need to hate is Doro. Let's lock in, sisters.
I don't want us to hate Doro.
Well, that makes one of us.
You alone, yeah, because I
I don't want to say Doro. Let's not hate Doro because if we hate Doro, we have to hate Anyanwu.
Okay, great. I can do two things. Contain multitudes, Bookie Butt. Yes.
You know me. This was from day one.
Insane. You know he's insane.
No.
Well,
stop, y'all. Oh, look, we out of time. We gotta get off this live because we gonna be here.
Exactly. I can chew and walk. I can chew gum and walk a sidewalk. I could do both. ¿Por qué no los dos? You know what I mean? I could do both.
Look, this is great. We done. We are done with Wild Seed. We start Minding My Mind next week. Be sure to read it. As I said, I'll be dropping the photocopied version of Survivor on the Substack. So make sure you're subscribed to the Substack. And I think that's all I got. The discussion questions will be out tomorrow morning on Mind of My Mind. Oh, let me say this. I want y'all to think about Mind of My Mind. I want y'all to think about the pattern as a mode of technology. And I want you to try to think about what happens when a Black woman becomes technology.
Okay.
So I want us to think about that, okay, as we move into Mind of My Mind, the second book of the pattern series.
Technology as in AI, or do you mean like how do you mean when Black women become technology? What do you mean?
Actually becomes the software.
Okay.
Okay.
What happens when, because and this is why I say this is also an academic thought that I'm working through on the back end. But I want you all to think about, we're in this moment of AI. And my argument or my suggestion is that before Elon Musk came up with Neuralink, Butler came up with the pattern. And if y'all don't know what Neuralink is, it is the brain to computer interfacing what is it? Neuralink is,
It's a lark. The long and short is it doesn't really exist yet. But yes, that's the idea behind it.
Yeah. So this is what they're playing with BCIs. Now, my thing is Butler imagined a world where AI was on the rise and what happens when people plug themselves into a system. But the Black woman is this system. Okay? So the pattern as a mode of either technology or, because you have to pay attention to what it does. But in order to pay attention to what it does, you have to pay attention to the holder, who is the protagonist of the next book. Without her, there is no that. So what happens when Black women become technology? This is an Afrofuturist type of question. And then the pattern as technology, as AI or a system. That's what I want us to think about. Okay? All right, y'all. It's been real. It's 7:40. I'm hungry. I gotta go. This will be uploaded on whenever it let me upload it between tonight and tomorrow. It'll be uploaded on the Octavia Butler Mixtape YouTube page. If you're not over there, subscribe, watch the replay. I holla. Good night, y'all. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah, no.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.